Welcome to my channel.
Chain in Lochdub didn't just fall, it engineered a hostile takeover of the landscape. It was a creeping, insidious Highland mist that soaked through the thickest tweed, defied waterproofs, and dampened the human spirit. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, however, had long ago developed an immunity to damp spirits, provided he was warm, relatively dry, and not being asked to do anything strenuous. He was currently ensconced in the deepest, most sagging armchair in the lounge of the Tommel Castle Hotel. His long, gangly frame was folded into a shape suggesting a discarded deck chair, and his flaming red hair was mashed against a faded antimacassar. To the untrained eye, Hamish Macbeth looked like a man whose highest ambition in life was to master the art of competitive napping while vertical. This was a carefully cultivated facade. Hamish nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee he hadn't paid for. Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, usually turned a blind eye in exchange for Hamish occasionally scaring off rowdy tourists, and actively ignored the fact that he was technically on duty. He stared out the rain-streaked window at the churning grey waters of the loch. His small police station, with its attached living quarters and his demanding sheep, seemed very far away. Hamish knew that in the Strathbane Police Headquarters, competence was punished with promotion. Promotion meant a transfer to the concrete jungle of the city, away from his mountains, his fishing, and his peace. His career goal, therefore, was to achieve a perfect, delicate equilibrium, doing just enough to remain employed, but never enough to be noticed by Chief Inspector Blair. He was contemplating the possibility of wandering down to the harbour later to see if any salmon had accidentally leaped into a net he might have foolishly left near the mouth of the river when the peace of the lounge was shattered. It wasn't the reliable, throaty chug of a local Land Rover that broke the silence. It was the high-pitched, expensive whine of a sports car protesting the potholes of the Sutherland roads. A moment later, the heavy oak door of the hotel banged open, admitting a gust of freezing mist and a creature entirely alien to Lochdub. She was clad from head to toe in pristine white designer ski wear, despite the nearest ski slope being 50 miles away and entirely devoid of snow. Huge, circular sunglasses shielded her eyes from the dim light of the hotel lobby. She was blonde, bronze, and vibrated with a frantic, terrifying energy. Hamish sank deeper into his chair, performing a near miraculous physical feat of trying to become part of the upholstery. He knew the type. Lochdub attracted them occasionally wealthy Southerners seeking Highland authenticity, who usually fled within a week when faced with the reality of midges, zero mobile signal, and the impenetrable, passive-aggressive stoicism of the locals. This one, however, felt different. There was a steely, unpleasant determination beneath the cashmere. "Hello? Is anyone actually alive in this mausoleum?" Her voice was a piercing cut-glass London bray that seemed to physically scrape against the stone walls of the hotel. It set Hamish's teeth on edge. The terrified teenage receptionist, Macy, popped up from behind the desk. "I require the penthouse suite, darling," the newcomer announced, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal eyes that assessed the lobby's value and found it wanting. "Can't. Do you have oat milk? My chakras are terribly misaligned by this barbaric drive up the A9. I need recalibrating." Hamish closed his eyes. He heard Mr. Johnson bustle out from the back office, his tone oozing the obsequious charm reserved for people with expensive luggage. "Welcome to the Tommel Castle, madam. I am sure we can accommodate you." "And you are?" "Serena St. Cloud," she declared, as if expecting applause. "I am a holistic dream weaver and architectural intuitive. I'm here to save this village." Hamish suppressed a groan. Saving the village usually meant ruining it. "I've come to buy that derelict monstrosity on the hill, the old manse," Serena continued, her voice echoing through the quiet lounge. "I'm going to convert it into the Highland sanctuary for the awakened self. It will be a beacon of light in this." She waved a manicured hand vaguely at the window and the relentless grey rain. "This dismal little corner of the world." Hamish opened one hazel eye. The old manse had been empty for 20 years, mostly because it was riddled with dry rot and owned by Angus MacGregor. A man so notoriously stubborn and misanthropic, he once refused to sell a pint of milk to the Queen's mother's chauffeur because he didn't like the look of the car. A sanctuary for the awakened self in Lochdub was about as welcome as a tax audit at a ceilidh. The clash between Serena St. Cloud's chakras and Angus MacGregor's Calvinist fury was going to be nuclear. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that rivaled the wind chimney. His quiet week of poaching and avoiding the telephone was over. The arrival of Serena St. Cloud was not just an irritation, it was an omen. Trouble hadn't just arrived in Lochdub, it had checked into the penthouse suite and ordered oat milk. The following 48 hours in Lochdub were, as Hamish had predicted, a masterclass in social friction. Serena St. Cloud did not so much settle into the village as she did lay siege to it. She was spotted marching through the rain in a pair of yellow Wellington boots that probably cost more than Hamish's annual tea budget, flanked by two wearer-looking assistants carrying clipboards and crystals. She had already managed to inform Mrs. Kennedy at the post office that the plastic beaded curtain was vibrationally offensive, and had suggested to the local blacksmith that he pivot his business toward artisanal copper singing bowls. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere in the village was as thick and sour as curdled cream. Hamish was standing outside his police station, trying to coax his dog, Lugs, a creature of indeterminate breed and legendary stubbornness, into a walk that didn't involve the immediate prospect of a biscuit. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine and wood smoke, the mountains half hidden behind a curtain of shifting, ghostly white mist. The peace was broken not by a scream, but by the frantic, uneven rattling of a bicycle. It was young Charlie, the delivery boy, his face the colour of a boiled turnip. He skidded to a halt, nearly taking out Hamish's vegetable patch. "PC Macbeth, PC Macbeth, you've got to come. It's the manse. It's that English woman." Hamish felt a familiar, heavy sinking sensation in his gut. It was the feeling of a man who saw his quiet afternoon of poached salmon and a nap evaporating into the Highland air. Deep breaths. "Charlie, what about Miss St. Cloud?" as she finally tried to ban the midges. "She's dead, Hamish. Stone dead. And she's blue." Hamish's brow furrowed. He hitched up his trousers, whistled for lugs, and began the trek up the steep, winding path toward the old manse. As he climbed, the rain began to fall again after a fine, persistent drizzle that seemed to mock his lack of an umbrella. When he reached the manse, he found the front door swinging open on rusted hinges, groaning in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp rot, old dust, and something cloyingly sweet, like expensive incense. He found Serena St. Cloud in the center of the derelict drawing room. The scene was as bizarre as the woman had been in life. She was seated cross-legged on a velvet yoga mat that looked absurdly bright against the grimy floorboards. Her head was thrown back, and her eyes were wide, staring vacantly at the peeling wallpaper on the ceiling. Charlie hadn't been exaggerating. Her lips and fingernails were indeed a ghostly cyanotic blue. Around her neck was draped a heavy, ornate healing necklace made of massive, jagged crystals, one of which appeared to be lodged awkwardly against her throat. Scattered around her were several cleansing candles that had burned down to puddles of scented wax, and a silver bowl containing a half-eaten salad of what looked like wilted weeds. Lugs gave a low, mournful whine and sat firmly in the doorway, refusing to enter. Hamish didn't blame him. He stood perfectly still, his hazel eyes moving slowly across the room. He didn't touch anything. He noticed the way the dust had been disturbed in a particular pattern near the window, and how the healing necklace was twisted in a way that didn't quite suggest a natural fall. "Och, Serena," Hamish murmured, his voice soft and tinged with a weary sadness. "You came to find yourself in the Highlands, and it looks like you found someone else instead." He knew what would happen next. He would have to call it in. The peaceful isolation of Lochdub was about to be invaded by the loud, abrasive machinery of the Strathbane police. Specifically, it would bring DC Fies Blair, a man who viewed Hamish with the same affection a gardener views a particularly stubborn patch of groundsel. Hamish sighed, reached into his pocket for a piece of string to idly knot, a habit that helped him think, and looked out the window. Down in the village, he could see the blue lights of an ambulance already snaking its way along the Lochside Road. The circus was coming to town, and as usual, Hamish Macbeth was expected to be the clown, while secretly holding the only map to the exit. He looked back at the body, a holistic dreamer dead in a house of rot. The irony was as sharp as a Highlander's dirk, and just as cold. The sound of the ambulance was soon drowned out by the aggressive gravel-spraying roar of two unmarked police cars. They screeched to a halt in the manse's overgrown driveway, nearly flattening Charlie's abandoned bicycle. Hamish didn't have to look out the window to know that the piece of Lochdub had officially been executed. A car door slammed with the force of a gunshot, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the rotting porch. Then came the voice, a coarse, nicotine-stained rasp that sounded like a saw hitting a knot in a pine board. "Macbeth, you great, ginger-headed vertical draft. Why is it every time a Sassenach drops dead in this god-forsaken wilderness, I find your useless face hovering over the body?" Detective Chief Inspector Blair burst into the drawing room, his face a vivid shade of pomegranate that suggested a dangerously high blood pressure. Behind him trailed the usual retinue of wearer-looking detectives from Strathbane, including the long-suffering Jimmy Anderson, who gave Hamish a subtle, sympathetic roll of his eyes. Hamish didn't move from his spot by the wall. He kept his hands deep in his pockets, his posture slouching with practiced laziness. "Good morning to you too, Mr. Blair. The kettle's no on, but I'm sure the local hotel would be happy to shut up, Macbeth," Blair barked, his eyes bulging as he took in the scene. He stepped toward the body, his heavy boots crunching through the layer of dust and dried lavender Serena had scattered. He peered down at the blue-tinted corpse of Serena St. Cloud with a mixture of disgust and professional boredom. "Look at this, crystals, candles, and a bowl of weeds. It's another one of those hippy-dippy types who thinks they can live on mountain air and positive vibes. Clearly, the daft woman poisoned herself with some natural remedy that turned out to be toxic. Look at hers, the color of a frozen turnip. She was meant to be buying the manse, sir," Hamish offered mildly, his eyes fixed on the way the heavy crystal necklace was snagged against the velvet of the yoga mat. Angus MacGregor was not exactly thrilled about the sanctuary for the awakened self she was planning. Blair snorted, a sound like a Highland bull with a sinus infection. "Angus MacGregor? That old fossil. He's 90 if he's a day. He couldn't kill a fly without needing a sit-down afterward. No, this is obvious. Accidental self-poisoning or a drug-induced hallucination gone wrong. She probably thought she could fly, and found out the floor was harder than her aura." "The window was open when I arrived, sir," Hamish said, gesturing toward the sash window that was currently rattling in the wind. "And Charlie, the boy who found her, said he saw a shadow moving toward the woods." Blair turned on him, his neck disappearing into his collar as his face darkened further. "A shadow? In the Highlands? In the rain? How revolutionary, Macbeth. Maybe it was a ghost, or a kelpie. Or maybe it was just your brain leaking out of your ears. It was the wind, you useless peasant. Now, get out. You're contaminating my crime scene with your presence and that four-legged rug you call a dog." Lugs, sensing the insult, let out a low, vibrating growl from the doorway. "I'll just be staying nearby to help with the locals, sir," Hamish said, his tone deceptively humble. "They can be a bit close-mouthed with outsiders." "I don't need a translator for Tuchta, Macbeth. I need a forensics team and a coffee that doesn't taste like peat bog water," Blair yelled. "Now, vanish. Go poach a salmon or whatever it is you do when you're pretending to be a policeman. If I see you within 100 yards of this investigation, I'll have you transferred to a traffic beat in Glasgow, so fast your red hair will turn white." Hamish nodded slowly, an expression of vacant obedience settling over his features. He whistled for lugs and began to retreat, but his mind was already cataloguing the details Blair had missed. The blue tint was not just on the lips, it was a specific, localized congestion. And the silver bowl of weedsit hadn't been finished. There was a faint, bitter almond scent beneath the heavy incense that didn't belong to lavender or sage. Out into the rain. Hamish felt the familiar itch of a mystery that didn't fit the official narrative. Blair wanted an accident, the village wanted the outsider gone. But as Hamish looked back at the looming dark silhouette of the manse, he knew that Serena St. Cloud hadn't just died of a dream. She had been silenced. He started down the hill, not toward his station, but toward the village shop. It was time for a mooch in Lochdub. A well-timed cup of tea was often more effective than a dozen forensic scientists. Hamish walked through the mist, Lugs trotting at his heels with an air of dignified protest that only a Highland dog could truly master. The village of Lochdub appeared through the grey veil like a charcoal sketch, its whitewashed cottages huddled together against the encroaching mountains, as if seeking warmth in numbers. He deliberately bypassed the police station, the site of DC Thur's car, parked aggressively across two spaces, made the air feel crowded and abrasive. To Hamish, the station currently represented paperwork, shouting, and a profound lack of imagination. Instead, he made a beeline for the post office and general store, the true intelligence hub of the Sutherland coast. The bell above the door tinkled with a cheerful, high-pitched ring that felt entirely out of place given the morning's grim discovery. Mrs. Kennedy was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the very tip of her nose like a bird on a precarious branch. She was sorting mail with a rhythmic vigor that suggested she was personally punishing each envelope for its contents. When Hamish entered, she didn't look up, but her nostrils flared as she caught the scent of wet tweed and damp dog. "Sure, if you're looking for more of that oat milk for the London lady, Hamish Macbeth, you can turn right back around and march to the harbour," Mrs. Kennedy said, her voice a sharp rasp. "The only person in this parish who drank that chalky, overpriced rubbish is currently being measured for a coffin." and I will not have the remaining cartons cluttering up my shelves. It's a bad omen, selling the milk of the dead. Now, Mrs. Kennedy, Hamish said, leaning his long elbows on the counter in a way that suggested he might never move again. He adopted his most vacant, harmless expression, the one that usually convinced people he was about as dangerous as a bowl of porridge. Is that any way to speak to the local constabulary? I'm here on official business. I require a tin of Lug's favourite biscuits. The ones with the marrow-bone centre that you keep hidden behind the shortbread. And perhaps a bit of the village news to wash the rain out of my ears. Mrs. Kennedy huffed, but her eyes sparkled behind her lenses. Information was the only currency she valued more than the Queen's head, and she had a wealth of it stored away. She reached under the counter for a tin that had been sitting there for some time, its lid slightly tarnished by the salty air. Gossip, is it? You mean the dream weaver finally weaving her last thread? The whole village is talking, Hamish. Angus MacGregor is down at the pub practically dancing a jig, though his knees are far too gone for a proper reel. He's telling everyone who will listen that the Sassenach witch was struck down by the very spirits she was trying to summon. Angus is an obvious one, Hamish mused, his hazel eyes wandering to the shelf of expensive herbal teas and vibrationally enhanced honey that Serena had insisted the shop stock. He but Blair thinks she poisoned herself. Some natural remedy gone wrong. He's convinced she took a wrong turn in her own chemistry set. Charlie said she looked a bit blue, though, almost like she's been sitting in the loch for a week. Blue? Mrs. Kennedy paused. A postcard for a relative in Glasgow held mid-air. Her expression shifted from irritation to a cold, sharp curiosity. She was plenty of things, Hamish, but she wasn't stupid about her health. She was in here 3 days ago, complaining that the air in the manse felt spiritually stagnant. She wasn't looking for crystals then, Hamish. She was looking for old maps. Detailed ones. Maps of what? Hamish asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old church lands, she replied, leaning in so close that Hamish could smell the faint, sharp scent of peppermint and old paper. And the boundaries of the Halbertons' Mythe estate. She said the old manse sat on a ley line of great power, but if you ask me, she was looking for a way to claim the fishing rights on the lower stretch of the river. She had a row with the minister too. Mr. Wellington, he's a peaceful man. But he didn't take kindly to her suggesting the kirk be turned into a meditation dome with mood lighting and floor cushions. Hamish processed this. The minister was indeed a mild man, but like many Highlanders, his mildness ended abruptly where his land or his traditions were concerned. And was anyone with her? Besides those two poor, shivering souls she called her assistants. A man, Mrs. Kennedy whispered, her eyes darting to the window as if the stranger might appear out of the mist. A Sassenach in a very expensive dark coat, not a tourist, Hamish. He looked like the kind of man who buys things just to break them and see how they're made. They were arguing outside the hotel on Tuesday night. He called her a liability. Those were his exact words, a liability. Hamish nodded slowly, his mind whirring beneath his sleepy exterior. A liability in the world of high-stakes land speculation was often a death sentence. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy, conveniently forgetting to pay for the dog biscuits, a debt she would surely add to his ever-growing tab, though neither of them mentioned it. He stepped back out into the persistent drizzle, the marrow-bone tin tucked under his arm. He decided his next stop should be the curry house. Mr. Patel, the owner, was a man of keen observation and even keener ears, since he provided the only alternative to the hotel's bland mutton stews and boiled potatoes. He saw almost everyone who passed through Lochstub. The smell of cumin, turmeric, and sizzling garlic hit Hamish as he entered the small, brightly lit shop. It was a sensory oasis in the middle of a damp, grey morning. Mr. Patel was polishing a brass tray, his face a mask of professional neutrality. P.C. Macbeth, a sad day for the chakras, I hear. The village is feeling very unaligned this morning. A sad day for everyone, Mr. Patel. Did Miss St. Cloud ever dine here? Or did she find the spices too aggressive for her aura? Once, Patel said, a wry smile touching his lips. She asked if my chicken boona was organic and ethically sourced. I told her the chicken had lived a very happy life until it met my chef's knife. She didn't stay to eat, but the man she was with, he stayed. He ordered the hottest vindaloo we make and didn't even break a sweat. A cold man, Macbeth. Very cold, even with the chili. Did you get a name? He paid with a corporate card. Apex Solutions. Does that mean anything to you? GT means, Hamish said, looking out at the heavy clouds rolling over the loch, that Blair is looking at a tragic accident, while I'm looking at a corporate takeover with a body count. Apex Solutions doesn't sound like a company that weaves dreams, Mr. Patel. It sounds like a company that ends them. Hamish left the shop, his heart heavy. He needed to speak to Priscilla Halberton Smythe, as the daughter of the local colonel, and a woman who moved in circles Serena St. Cloud could only dream of. She would know if Apex Solutions had been sniffing around the glen. She was his link to the world of the upper class, a world where murders were often committed with a pen before they were finished with a poison. As he walked toward the hotel, Hamish noted a black Carno, a police vehicle idling near the bridge. It was a sleek, aggressive machine that looked entirely out of place against the rutted stone. It was the same expensive sports car he had seen Serena in when she first arrived. But Serena was currently lying on a cold slab in Strathbane. Someone else was driving her dream now, and as the rain turned into a heavy downpour, Hamish knew that the shadows in Lockdub were about to get much longer. The gravel drive of the Tommel Castle Hotel was a treacherous slurry of grey slush and sharp stones, and by the time Hamish reached the porch, his boots were encased in a layer of muck that would have horrified the hotel's meticulous housekeeping staff. Luggs, sensing the impending warmth of the interior, shook himself vigorously, sending a spray of icy Highland rain in every direction. Hamish didn't mind the damp. He was used to it, much like he was used to the persistent, low-level ache in his chest whenever he was about to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe. A romantic complication he frequently tried to bury under layers of apathy and poaching stories. Yet it remained, as stubborn as a Sutherland midge in late August. He entered the hotel, his ginger hair plastered to his forehead, and stood for a moment in the foyer, letting the heat from the roaring peat fire defrost his senses. He found Priscilla in the sunroom, though there was precious little sun to be seen. She was the picture of effortless Highland aristocracy, dressed in a cashmere sweater the colour of a robin's egg, and a skirt of muted tweed that managed to look fashionable rather than frumpy. She was reading a slim volume of poetry, but she looked up as Hamish approached, a flicker of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps genuine warmth crossing her elegant features. To Hamish, she always looked like she had been carved from the very finest marble, cool and perfect, while he felt like a roughly hewn block of local granite. "Hamish," she said, her voice like a well-poured sherry, "you look like something the lock decided to reject. I take it the excitement at the old manse has reached a fever pitch. My father is currently in the library fuming about the police invasion. He says DC Vi. Blair's voice is curdling the cream in the kitchen." Hamish pulled up a spindly chair that groaned under his weight. "Blair is being Blair, Priscilla. He's decided it was an accident, a bit of bad luck with a crystal and some herbal tea. But the woman was blue, and not the kind of blue you get from a cold wind. There's a smell about it, and I don't just mean the incense." He leaned forward, his hazel eyes losing their sleepy glaze. "Tell me about Serena St. Cloud. You move in the circles that attract people like her. Was she really here to weave dreams and align chakras, or was she weaving something a bit more tangible?" Priscilla set her book aside, her expression turning thoughtful. Serena was a fraud, Hamish, but a very specific kind of fraud. She wasn't just a holistic dreamer. 5 years ago, she was Serena Miller, a rather ruthless junior partner in a London property firm. She had a spectacular nervous breakdown, or so the gossip columns said, and rebranded herself as a spiritualist. But people don't lose their appetite for money just because they start wearing crystals. I heard rumours at a dinner party in Edinburgh last month that she was looking for undervalued assets in the north. She wasn't here for the scenery, Hamish. She was here for the water. "The water?" Hamish asked, his brow furrowing. "You mean the loch?" "No," Priscilla replied, tapping a manicured finger against the mahogany table. "The old manse sits directly above the source of the Tommel Spring. It's some of the purest water in Scotland. There was a plan years ago to bottle it, but the locals fought it tooth and nail. If someone bought the manse, they would own the access rights. It's worth a fortune to the right corporation. Someone like Apex Solutions, perhaps." Hamish felt a jolt of recognition. Mr. Patel at the curry house mentioned them. A man with a corporate card from Apex was seen arguing with her. He called her a liability. If Serena was the front for a corporate land grab, and she started getting ideas of her own, perhaps actually wanting to turn the place into a sanctuary instead of a bottling plant, she would indeed be a liability, a very expensive one. Priscilla nodded. She was always quite headstrong. She had a change of heart, or if she tried to blackmail her backers for a bigger cut of the water rights, they wouldn't have been pleased. "The man you're looking for might be a Mr. Julian Vane. He is the CEO of Apex. I saw him at the hotel bar 2 nights ago. He's a man who treats a conversation like a business acquisition. He was asking very pointed questions about the local council and how easily they might be persuaded to change zoning laws." "Vane," Hamish repeated the name. tasting the coldness of it. Blair won't listen to a word of this. He's already drafting his report for the Procurator Fiscal. He wants this closed and buried so he can get back to his favourite pub in Strathbane. He won't look at corporate cards or water rights. He wants a dead hippie and an easy life. Then you'll have to do it yourself, Hamish, Priscilla said, her eyes meeting his with a directness that always made him feel slightly exposed. But be careful. People like Julian Vane don't just murder people with blue lips, they murder reputations and careers. If you get in his way, hell have you crushed. Hamish stood up, the chair giving another mournful creak. He wouldn't be the first, Priscilla. And besides, I've not much of a career to lose, have I? As long as they don't take away my stove and my dog, I'm a hard man to threaten. He looked at her, wanting to say something more, something about the way the light caught her hair, but the moment passed, and he simply nodded. Thank you for the tea. I'll be seeing you. As he walked away, he felt her gaze on his back. It was a familiar sensation, a mixture of comfort and a longing for a life he knew he could never quite fit into. He stepped out of the sunroom and back into the main lobby, his mind spinning. Cassanack tension he had felt earlier was not just about culture, it was about the literal lifeblood of the village. The water. He needed to find Angus MacGregor. If Serena had been trying to buy the manse for its water, Angus would have known. And Angus, for all his crankiness, was a man who knew every inch of the land he sat on. The rain had intensified into a horizontal assault as Hamish stepped back outside. The wind howled through the eaves of the hotel, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the silence of the dead woman on the hill. He adjusted his cap, whistled for lugs, and began the walk toward the village pub. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was a dark one. It wasn't just a murder of passion or a moment of madness. It was a cold, calculated removal of a liability. And in the Highlands, where the land was everything, people had been killed for far less than a mountain spring. Hamish trudged on, his long legs eating up the distance, his eyes scanning the grey horizon. Somewhere in the mist, a killer was waiting, thinking they had committed the perfect, untraceable crime. They didn't realize that in Lockdub, even the stones had ears, and the local policeman had a very long memory for things people didn't say. He reached the village bridge, the water of the loch churning below him like a dark, restless spirit. He thought of the blue lips of Serena St. Cloud and the cold eyes of Julian Vane. The Dreamweaver was dead, but the nightmare she had brought to the Highlands was only just beginning to wake up. The MacLean Arms was the sort of establishment where the air was composed of equal parts peat smoke, stale beer, and the heavy, unspoken weight of centuries of grievances. It was the ancestral home of the village's collective grumble. And today, the grumbling had been replaced by a festive, almost electric atmosphere. The news of Serena St. Cloud's demise had travelled through Lockdub faster than a winter gale, and while nobody was quite uncorking the expensive champagne, there was a definite uptick in the consumption of the special malt. Hamish pushed open the heavy oak door, lugs following with a wary glance at the sawdust on the floor. The dog knew that in this pub, crumbs were rare and usually guarded by the resident ginger cat, a battle-scarred veteran of many a barroom scuffle. Hamish shook his dripping cap and made his way toward the corner table where Angus MacGregor sat enthroned, a glass of amber liquid held in a hand that looked like a bunch of knotted gorse roots. "I hear the wicked witch is dead," Angus croaked, a wicked glint in his watery blue eyes. "And the sky didn't fall, and the loch didn't boil over. It's a fine day for Scotland, Macbeth. A fine day indeed." Hamish pulled out a stool, the wood groaning in sympathy. "It's a day for a funeral, Angus, which is rarely considered fine by the person in the box. And I hear you were seen arguing with her at the gates of the manse just yesterday afternoon. Something about a fence line and a ley line." Angus let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a hack. "She told me my stone wall was blocking the energetic flow of the hillside. I told her the only thing it was blocking was her trespassing on my grazing land. She threatened to have her lawyers turn my cottage into a car park for her sanctuary. I told her that if she set foot on my land again, I would see she was planted in it. It wasn't a threat, Macbeth. It was a promise of agricultural improvement." Before Hamish could respond, the pub door didn't just open, it practically detonated. DCY Blair marched in, followed by two constables who looked like they were trying to hide behind their own notebooks. Blair's face had progressed from a pomegranate hue to a deep, alarming shade of beetroot. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on Angus, and a predatory, unpleasant smile curled his thin lips. He tapped a pair of handcuffs against his thigh with a rhythmic, menacing click. "Angus MacGregor," Blair thundered, his voice echoing off the low-beamed ceiling. I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Serena St. Cloud. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt a windbag like you knows the meaning of the word. Stand up. The pub went silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to skip a beat. Angus didn't move. He simply stared at Blair with the calm, detached boredom of a man who had survived 2 world wars and several outbreaks of potato blight. On what grounds, you loud-mouthed lowlander? On the grounds that we found a bottle of concentrated cyanide-based pesticide in your garden shed. Macgregor, Blair shouted, leaning over the table until he was inches from Angus' nose. The same substance that turned the deceased's lips the color of a cheap suit. We also have a witness who heard you promising to plant her in the ground. It's an open and shut case. You hated her, you threatened her, and you had the means to do it. You thought you could get away with it because you're a local character. Well, the character is going to a cell in Strathbane. Hamish watched as the constable stepped forward to hoist the elderly man to his feet. Angus looked more annoyed than frightened, his main concern appearing to be the half-full glass of whiskey he was being forced to leave behind. Blair glanced at Hamish, his eyes gleaming with triumph. See that, Macbeth? That's called police work. Not sitting in a hotel lounge with your thumb up your nose. While you were mooching, I was finding the murder weapon. I'll have the confession before dinner. As they led Angus out into the rain, the pub erupted into a low, angry murmur. Hamish stayed where he was, his fingers idly tracing the rings of moisture on the table. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the obviousness of the evidence, though finding a murder weapon in an unlocked shed was a bit like finding a neon sign saying I did it was something smaller. He stood up and walked toward the window, watching Blair shove Angus into the back of a police van. Lugs, Hamish murmured, the dog looking up expectantly. Do you remember Serena's cat? That white, fluffy thing she called Moonbeam. Lugs tilted his head. Serena had been inseparable from that cat. Shed claimed it was her spirit familiar and had been seen carrying it around the village in a designer papoose. But Hamish hadn't seen the cat at the crime scene. He hadn't seen it in the hotel. And most importantly, he hadn't seen it near Angus' cottage. Angus had a terrier named Jock, who was a notorious feline assassin. If Serena had been at Angus's shed to be poisoned, or if Angus had been near her, that white cat would have been a flurry of fur and claws. More importantly, Hamish thought about the blue. Blair called it pesticide. But Angus was a traditionalist. He used old-fashioned, smelly chemicals that lingered on the hands and clothes for days. Angus smelled of tobacco, wet wool and ancient dust, not the sharp, sterile, almond-like chemical scent Hamish had detected at the manse. And then there was the matter of Serena's boots. When Hamish saw her in the hotel, they were pristine. When he saw her body, they were still relatively clean, despite the struggle or the walk to the shed Blair was imagining. Hamish realized with a cold certainty that Angus was a perfect red herring. He was the local everyone expected to snap. He was the easy arrest that would let Blair look like a hero while the real killer walked away. The poison wasn't a farm chemical, it was something far more sophisticated, something corporate. Julian Vane and Apex Solutions did not deal in garden sheds. They dealt in laboratories and liabilities. Come on, Lugs, Hamish said, his voice tightening. We need to find that cat. And we need to find out why a woman who supposedly died of natural tea had a missing designer pet and a pristine pair of boots in a muddy Highland glen. He stepped out of the pub, the rain lashing against his face. He wasn't going to Strathbane to save Angus. He was going back to the old manse. He needed to look at what wasn't there, because in the world of Hamish Macbeth, the loudest evidence was usually the biggest lie. The trap had been set for Angus, but Hamish was starting to see the shadow of the person who had pulled the string. It wasn't a useless peasant on a hill, it was a predator in a suit, and they had underestimated the man with the red hair and the sleepy eyes. The ascent to the old manse felt longer the second time, the gravity of the Highland hills seeming to increase with every drop of rain that soaked into Hamish's thick, salt and pepper tweed jacket. Lugs was no longer trotting, he was trudging, his tail a sodden, heavy pendulum that mirrored his master's weary gait. Hamish ignored the persistent squelch of his boots, his mind occupied by the glaring inconsistencies that Deceithirst I had so gleefully trampled over. Blair wanted a villain who fit a stereotype, the angry, land-protective crofter, but Hamish knew that while Angus MacGregor might be capable of many things, including the imaginative use of profanity, he was a man of the earth. If Angus wanted you gone, he would tell you to your face while standing on your toes. He wouldn't sneak a sophisticated poison into a delicate silver bowl of weeds. It lacked the necessary drama for a MacGregor feud. The manse stood like a skeletal sentinel against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the bruised purple of the approaching dusk. The police tape fluttered in the wind, a bright yellow intrusion on the grey stone. Hamish didn't enter through the front door this time. He circled the house, his eyes on the ground, looking for the small, dainty prints of a white cat. He found them near the coal cellar tinny, mud-caked paws that led toward a broken basement window. He crouched down, his knees popping like dry twigs. "Moonbeam, come on now, puss. I have a bit of salmon for you," he lied, having already eaten his lunch, but counting on the cat's sense of entitlement. A soft, high-pitched mew echoed from the darkness of the cellar. A moment later, a very disheveled white cat squeezed through the gap, its pristine fur now a patchwork of soot and cobwebs. Tra. It looked at Hamish with an expression of profound betrayal. I know," Hamish whispered, reaching out to scoop the creature up. It didn't fight him, it seemed relieved to find a warm, if slightly damp, human. As he stood, he noticed something caught in the cat's fur, small, bright blue petal. Not a natural Highland flower, but a silk one, the kind used in high-end floral arrangements, or as a decorative garnish for a wellness tea. He tucked the cat under his arm and walked around to the kitchen entrance. The door was ajar. Inside, he found Clara, the quieter of Serena's two assistants, methodically packing boxes. She looked up, startled, her pale face framed by lank, mouse-brown hair. She was the very image of the invisible subordinate, the kind of person people talked over at dinner parties. "PC Macbeth," she said, her voice thin and tremulous. "I thought everyone had gone. DCI Blair said they had caught the man responsible, that horrible old farmer." That's what the DCI thinks," Hamish said, setting the cat down on the scarred wooden table. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of Moonbeam, but she didn't reach for the animal. "But I was wondering about the cat, and about the tea. It's a very specific blue, Clara. Like the blue butterfly pea flower tea Serena was always promoting on her social media. Very trendy, very expensive. But it doesn't usually cause respiratory failure, unless it has been spiked with something that has a bitter almond scent." Clara went back to her packing, her movements stiff. Serena was a genius, you know. She had such a vision for this place. It's a tragedy that a local ruffian would end it all over a property dispute. "Is it?" Hamish moved closer, his presence filling the small kitchen. "Priscilla Halberton-Smythe tells me Serena was a property developer before she was a dreamer. And Mr. Patel tells me Apex Solutions was paying the bills. It seems Serena was about to sell this sanctuary before the first crystal was even charged in the moonlight. She was going to take the money and run back to London, wasn't she? Leaving her vision and her assistants behind." Clara's hand paused over a stack of Dreamweaver brochures. A flicker of something sharp and ugly crossed her face, gone as quickly as a shadow on the loch. She was the face of the company. "Constable, I was the one who wrote the books. I was the one who researched the ancient traditions. I was the one who found the Tommel Spring. And she was going to sell it all to Julian Vane for a bottling plant. She called us overhead. She said we weren't part of the corporate transition." Hamish sighed. It was the oldest story in the world, not a clash of cultures, but a betrayal of trust. And if Serena died before the contract was signed, the rights to the Dreamweaver brand and the research would revert to the co-creator. To you, Clara, the corporate deal would fall through, the manse would stay empty, and you'd finally have the fame you thought she'd stolen. "That's a very imaginative theory, Constable," Clara said, her voice regaining its composure. "But I was in the hotel lounge all morning. There are witnesses." Witnesses saw you in the lounge," Hamish agreed, his gaze falling on her feet. She was wearing a pair of sensible, sturdy loafers, but tucked into the corner of the half-packed box was a pair of yellow Wellington boots, the exact same size and brand Serena had been wearing. And they were covered in a very specific type of orange-tinted mud found only in the garden shed of Angus MacGregor. Hamish looked at the blue petal in the cat's fur, then at the boots. He realized then that the blue wasn't just the tea, it was a deliberate signature, a petty, human act of vengeance using the victim's own vanity against her. Clara hadn't just killed Serena. She had tried to frame the one man in the village she knew Hamish would be forced to investigate. It wasn't about the water or the money, it was about the humiliation of being overhead. "I think," Hamish said softly, "that we should have another look at those boots, Clara, and maybe a look at the cat's fur. Moonbeam was with you yesterday, wasn't she?" "Not with Serena. You took the cat to Angus's shed to make sure the scent of his dog would be on her, just in case someone like me started asking questions." Clara stared at him, the helpful assistant facade finally crumbling to reveal a cold, simmering resentment. The Highland wind rattled the window panes, a lonely sound that seemed to mock the smallness of her ambition. Hamish felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. The crime wasn't a grand mystery of the mountains, it was a squalid little murder, born of a bruised ego. He needed to set the trap. He needed her to believe she was still smarter than the lazy policeman. He reached for his radio, but then paused, a slow, deceptive smile spreading across his face. "But oh, what do I know?" Hamish muttered, looking vacant again. "I'm just a village bobby who can't even keep his dog dry. I'll leave the heavy lifting to Mr. Blair. He'll be back for those boxes soon. Best make sure everything is tidy." He turned to leave, but he knew exactly what Clara would do next. Chef, the villain always underestimated the man who liked to sit quietly and listen to what wasn't said. And Clara, in her arrogance, had just told him everything. Hamish walked back out into the rain, the cat still tucked under his arm. He could feel Clara's eyes on his back, a prickle of malice that made the hair on his neck stand up. Lugs gave a short, sharp bark, sensing his master's tension. The pieces were finally together, but the most difficult part was yet to come. He had to prove that the invisible assistant had walked a mile in Serena's boots, literally. The motive was as old as the hills themselves. The desire to be seen, to be valued, and the terrible things people do when they feel they are being erased. Serena St. Cloud had tried to erase Clara, and Clara had responded by erasing Serena's life. It was a tragedy of errors, played out in the damp, decaying rooms of the old manse. As he descended the hill toward the village, the lights of Lochdub began to twinkle through the mist, a reminder of the community he was sworn to protect. He thought of Angus sitting in his cold cell in Strathbane, and of Blair, lightly celebrating his genius with a double whiskey. He would have to move quickly. The corporate interests of Apex Solutions were still lurking in the shadows, and Julian Vane was not the type to let a little thing like a murder stop a profitable acquisition. Hamish would have to play them all against each other. He would have to be the stupid policeman one last time, for the sake of the village and the sake of justice. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice a low growl against the wind. "We have a trap to set, and I suspect it's going to require a very large pot of tea and a very small amount of truth." Highland night was closing in, but for the first time since the Dreamweaver arrived, Hamish Macbeth could see the way forward clearly. The blue lips, the white cat, and the yellow boots, they were the threads of a story that was about to reach its final, messy conclusion. And Hamish, the man who avoided work at all costs, was ready to finish the job. The descent into the village was a study in strategic theatre, a performance directed at an audience of one. Hamish Macbeth walked with a deliberate, exaggerated slouch, the white cat moonbeam tucked securely within the cavernous folds of his wet jacket. He looked for all the world like a man who had conceded defeat to the elements and the superior intellect of his superiors in Strathbane. Lugs followed, his head low, sensing the subtle shift in his master's energy. The rain had settled into a fine, rhythmic drumming against the slate roofs of Lochdub, a sound that usually lulled the village into an early slumber, but tonight, the lights in the Tommel Castle Hotel burned with an uncharacteristic, nervous brightness. Hamish knew that Clara would be there, tucked away in the shadows of the staff wing or the sunroom, waiting for the final word that the stupid policeman had given up. He pushed open the heavy doors of the hotel, the warmth of the lobby hitting him like a physical blow. He stood in the center of the patterned carpet, letting a small pool of lock water form at his feet. Mr. Johnson, the manager, scurried forward, his face a mask of professional irritation that quickly dissolved into curiosity at the sight of the white cat. "Constable Macbeth, surely you are not bringing that creature back here?" DCI Blair was quite clear that the property of the deceased was to be held as evidence. Johnson whispered, his eyes darting toward the stairs where a few curious tourists lingered. "Och, the DCI has his hands full with Angus MacGregor," Hamish said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the alcove where he had spotted a flash of Clara's mousy hair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it against his damp thigh. "He sent me to return the cat and to deliver a message to the staff. It seems the forensics boys in Strathbane are a bit more clever than we gave them credit for. They've found something in the victim's tissue that's very rare, synthetic marker, they call a chromatographic something or other. It's a very modern scientific sort of thing, you understand." Priscilla Halberton-Smythe appeared at the top of the stairs, her presence acting as the perfect catalyst for his trap. She descended slowly, her eyes searching Hamish's face for the truth she knew he was hiding behind his vacant expression. "What sort of marker, Hamish? Surely a simple pesticide would not require such a specialized term." Hamish looked up at her, blinking with practiced dullness. "Well, you see, Priscilla, this isn't just a farm chemical, it's a corporate-grade substance. The lab says it leaves a residue that is invisible to the naked eye, but glows like a lighthouse when exposed to a specific ultraviolet frequency. They're sending an expert up from Glasgow. First thing tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp, with a luminol spectrum analyzer. He's going to scan the entire manse, every inch of the hotel, and every pair of boots in the parish. He says that even if you've washed your clothes 10 times, the blue signature will stay in the seams for weeks. She saw the subtle stiffening of Clara's silhouette in the background. It was a small thing, a slight intake of breath, a tightening of the shoulders, but to Hamish, it was as loud as a gunshot. The expert is staying over in Strathbane tonight, Hamish continued, leaning confidentially toward Mr. Johnson, while still projecting his voice. He's bringing a portable incinerator for any contaminated footwear he finds. Apparently, the substance is so toxic, it has to be destroyed on the spot. It's a terrible business, really. My own boots are probably going to be melted down just for being in the same room as the poor woman. That sounds remarkably high-tech for a Highland investigation, Priscilla noted, her voice tinged with a suspicion that she played along with perfectly. She knew Hamish's science was a creative blend of half-remembered police manuals and sheer bluff, but she also knew his intuition was rarely wrong. Well, the chief constable is very keen on the modern policing initiative, Hamish sighed, looking mournfully at his own mud-caked boots. I'm going to go back to the manse tonight to ensure nobody contaminates the area further before the specialist arrives. Not that anyone would be daft enough to go near that place in this weather. I'll likely just fall asleep in the kitchen and wait for the morning. Hamish turned and made his exit, leaving the cat with a bewildered receptionist. He didn't look back. He knew that the seed had been planted in fertile soil. Clara was a meticulous woman. She was a researcher, a person who lived in the details. The thought of a molecular signature that could survive a washing machine would be a nightmare she couldn't ignore. She had the yellow boots, and she had the tea canisters. She was as smart as she thought she was. She wouldn't risk waiting for the expert to arrive. She would have to dispose of the evidence tonight, and she would have to do it somewhere the luminol analyzer wouldn't look. The trek back up the hill was silent. Hamish didn't return to the kitchen of the manse as he had claimed. Instead, he and Luggs took up a position in a dense thicket of gorse and rowan trees, overlooking the old peat bog behind the property. The bog was a dark, bottomless expanse of black mud and stagnant water, a place where things disappeared and stayed disappeared for centuries. It was the only logical place for a panicked murderer to dump a pair of bright yellow boots and a silver tea bowl. The rain had lessened to a silver needle prick, and the wind had dropped to a low, mournful sigh. Hamish settled himself against a mossy rock, his long legs stretched out, his eyes fixed on the rear service entrance of the manse. He didn't move. He didn't even smoke his pipe, despite the craving that gnawed at his resolve. He simply sat and listened to the silence of the Highlands. He knew that people often made the mistake of thinking of the Highlands as empty, but to Hamish, the mountains were crowded with the ghosts of mistakes past. Hours passed. The village clock in the distance struck midnight, the sound muffled by the mist. Luggs suddenly shifted, his ears swiveling toward the house. A low, vibrating growl started in his chest, but a gentle hand from Hamish silenced him instantly. A door creaked. It was a thin, high-pitched sound that was almost lost in the rustle of the leaves. A small, dark figure emerged from the back of the manse, carrying a heavy, bulging bin liner. The figure moved with a frantic, jerky gait, heading straight for the edge of the peat bog. Hamish watched through the gloom as Clara reached the marshy bank. She paused, looking over her shoulder at the dark silhouette of the house, her breathing coming in ragged, audible gasps. She began to pull things from the bag: the yellow boots, a stack of blue-stained silk petals, and a small silver canister. She was so focused on the black water in front of her that she didn't hear the soft squelch of Hamish's boots behind her. The trap hadn't just been set, the prey was already inside, and she was busy closing the door on herself. Hamish waited until she had the boots in her hands, poised to throw, before he spoke. "It's a long walk for a bit of rubbish, Clara," he said softly. The woman shrieked, the yellow boots flying from her hands to land with a wet, heavy thud in the soft mud at the edge of the bog. She spun around, her face a pale, terrified mask in the moonlight. Hamish Macbeth stood there, looking tired and unkempt, his hands in his pockets, the very image of the useless peasant she had so desperately underestimated. The Highlands, it seemed, had a way of revealing the truth, even in the deepest dark. Clara stood frozen, her silhouette a jagged tear in the velvet curtain of the Highland night. The yellow boots, those bright and garish symbols of Serena's stolen authority, lay like wounded birds in the black, oily sludge of the peat bog. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thumping of the rain on the heather and the distant, mournful lowing of a cow in a far-off barn. Then, the silence was shattered by a sound that didn't belong in the natural world, a high, thin, and brittle laugh that climbed the scale toward madness. Clara turned fully toward Hamish, her face no longer the mask of a mouse-brown assistant, but a map of raw, unadulterated hatred. Her eyes, usually cast downward in a display of professional humility, were wide and burning with a frantic light that made Lug's hackles rise in an instinctive warning. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Macbeth?" She spat, the words dripping with a venom that Serena herself would have admired. "Standing there in your dank tweed, acting like the simple village bobby while you play your little games. You and your molecular signatures and your Glasgow experts. Do you really take me for such a fool? I've spent 10 years researching the cutting edge of every holistic and scientific trend for that woman. I know there is no such thing as a luminol spectrum analyzer for blue tea. You lied to me." Hamish didn't move. He leaned slightly against a gnarled rowan tree, his hands still buried in his pockets, his posture radiating a deceptive, bone-deep fatigue. I did lie, Clara. But a lie only works if the person hearing it has a guilty conscience to feed it. If you were innocent, you would have laughed at the idea of a glowing tea stain. You would have stayed in the hotel, sipping your own herbal brew and waiting for the morning. But you can't, could you? Because Serena wasn't the only one who believed in the power of the invisible. You've been invisible for a decade, writing her books, building her brand, and watching her take the credit while she planned to discard you like a used filter. You didn't kill her for the money, did you? You killed her because she was going to make you invisible forever. She was a parasite, Clara screamed, her voice cracking against the wind. She lunged toward the mud, reaching for the bag, her fingers clawing at the yellow plastic. She was a hollow, narcissistic shell who didn't know the difference between a ley line and a clothesline. I built that sanctuary. I found the spring. And she was going to sell it to Vaneto, a man who only sees water in terms of profit margins. She told me I could stay on as a consultant, after I gave her my life. So you gave her a bit of blue butterfly PT instead, Hamish said, his voice soft and steady, mixed with a touch of that concentrated cyanide pesticide you swiped from Angos Shed. You knew Blair would look at the local man first. You even wore her boots and took her cat to leave a trail. It was a very tidy plan, Clara, right up until the moment you realized that a useless peasant like me might actually be looking at you. Clara's hand closed around the strap of the bin liner. With a sudden, desperate surge of energy, she didn't try to run away, she tried to run deeper into the bog. She knew the Terraner thought she did. She intended to sink the evidence in the deepest part of the quagmire, where no diver would ever find it. But the Highland bogs are treacherous mistresses, and the heavy rain had turned the stable ground into a shifting, deceptive trap. "Clara, stop!" Hamish shouted, his laziness vanishing in an instant. He moved with a sudden, startling fluidity that belied his gangly frame. He was across the heather in seconds, his boots sinking into the periphery of the muck. Clara didn't stop. She took another step, her weight shifting onto a patch of bright green moss that looked like solid land, but was actually a floating carpet over a watery abyss. She let out a choked gasp as the ground gave way, her legs disappearing into the freezing black sludge. The bin liner, weighted down by the boots and the silver canisters, acted like an anchor, pulling her further down into the grip of the peat. "Help!" she shrieked, the hatred in her voice replaced by a primal, shivering terror. "It's pulling me under! Macbeth, help me!" Hamish didn't hesitate. He knew the danger of the sucking mud. He had seen sheep disappear in minutes in these hills. He threw himself flat onto the firmer ground at the edge, extending his long arms toward her. "Grab my hand, Clara. Let go of the bag. Drop it." "I can't," she wailed, her fingers locked in a death grip on the evidence. In her fractured mind, the bag was her only hope of escape from the law, even as it became the instrument of her literal drowning. Hamish reached further, his chest pressing into the cold, wet heather. He grabbed her wrist just as she sank to her waist. The mud made a grotesque, wet sucking sound, a hungry noise that echoed in the dark. With a grunt of effort, Hamish began to haul her back. He wasn't just pulling a woman, he was fighting the ancient, relentless weight of the Highlands. His muscles bunched and strained, his face turning a dark, weathered red as he used every ounce of the strength he usually kept hidden behind his easygoing facade. Lugs was barking frantically, circling the edge of the pit, his instincts telling him his master was in peril. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Hamish dragged the sobbing, mud-caked woman from the moor of the bog. It was a messy, undignified struggle. By the time he pulled her onto the solid bank, They were both covered from head to toe in the foul-smelling black peat. Clara collapsed into a heap, shivering violently, her designer clothes ruined, her ambition extinguished by the cold reality of the Sutherland earth. Hamish sat back on his heels, gasping for breath, his lungs burning in the chilled air. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a man who had been dragged through a sewer. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of heavy iron handcuffs, the metal glinting dully in the moonlight. "Clara Miller," he panted, his voice raspy but firm. "I am arresting you for the murder of Serena St. Cloud, and I'm also arresting you for being a damn fool. You nearly died for a pair of yellow boots and a bit of blue tea." He clicked the cuffs into place around her mud-stained wrists. The messy arrest was complete. The killer was caught, the evidence was secured at the edge of the pit, and the Highland night had finally reclaimed its silence. As he stood up, swaying slightly from the exertion, Hamish looked toward the lights of Lochdub. The hard part was over, but the most delicate part, the part where he had to deal with DCI Blair's ego, was just beginning. He whistled for lugs, gripped Clara by the arm, and began the long, cold walk back down the mountain. The Dreamweaver story was finished, and now Hamish Macbeth just wanted a hot bath and a very large pot of tea. The walk back from the black, sucking mouth of the peat bog was a long and shivering endurance test. Hamish Macbeth felt the thick, cold mud drying on his skin, tightening like a second, far less comfortable suit of clothes. Clara offered no further resistance. She seemed to have shrunk within herself. The fire of her resentment extinguished by the icy waters of the Sutherland earth. She moved with a mechanical, shuffling gait, her head bowed as the handcuffs rattled softly in the darkness. Lugs followed at a distance, his tail held low, sensing the profound exhaustion that had settled into his master's long, gangly frame. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village, the streetlights cast long, shivering shadows across the road, reflecting off the puddles like shards of broken glass. Hamish didn't head for the hotel to seek the comfort of the fire. He headed straight for the small, whitewashed police station, where a single, harsh light still burned in the window. He could hear DCI Blair before he even reached the porch. The DCI was shouting into a telephone, his voice a gravelly, nicotine-stained roar that likely could be heard by the seals in the harbour. "And I don't care if he's 90 years old. He's a murderer. I want the formal paperwork ready by dawn, and I want a transport van sent up from Strathbane immediately." Hamish pushed the door open, the bell giving a tired, high-pitched jingle that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. He stood there, a towering column of black mud and exhaustion, holding a shivering, mud-caked Clara by the arm. Behind him, the bin liner of evidence leaked a dark, brackish trail across the pristine floorboards that Blair's team had likely spent the afternoon sweeping. Blair slammed the phone down and turned, his eyes bulging until they looked like they might pop from his pomegranate-coloured face. "Macbeth! What in the name of all that is holy have you been doing? You look like you've been auditioning for a role as a swamp monster. And why is the assistant in cuffs? I told you to stay away from the case. I told you I had the killer in custody." Hamish adopted his most apologetic hangdog expression, his hazel eyes wide and vacant. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Blair. Truly I am. I was just out taking lugs for a bit of a late-night wander. The poor beast had a nervous stomach from all the excitement. You see, when this lady here came charging out of the manse like the hounds of hell were after her, she practically tripped over me and fell right into the peat bog. I had to fish her out, and then she started babbling all sorts of nonsense about blue tea and yellow boots. I thought I'd better bring her straight to you, seeing as you're the one who's been putting the real pressure on." Blair's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Pressure? Babbling, you say?" "Aye," Hamish said, nodding earnestly, a small clump of dried peat falling from his hair and landing on Blair's desk. "She said she couldn't take the heat anymore. She said your brilliant arrest of Angus MacGregor made her realize that a forensic mind like yours would eventually find the hidden truth. She was trying to hide the evidence, sir. These yellow boots here and the silver tea canisters. She thought if she could just get rid of them before your high-tech experts arrived in the morning, she would be safe. But the sheer weight of your investigation, well, it broke her. She just gave up the ghost when she saw me, thinking I was one of your elite surveillance units." Blair puffed out his chest, his waistcoat buttons straining under the sudden influx of professional pride. The angry red hue of his face shifted toward a satisfied, smug glow. He looked at the shivering Clara and then back at the bag of evidence. Did she now? Well, I knew that arresting the old man would rattle the real cage. It's a classic tactical maneuver. Macbeth, you squeeze the obvious suspect to create a vacuum of panic, and then you wait for the weak link to snap. I've used it 100 times in the city. It requires a certain psychological finesse. It was a masterstroke, sir, Hamish said, suppressing a shudder that had nothing to do with the freezing cold. If you hadn't been so decisive and arrested Angus so quickly, she'd likely have stayed quiet and sold the manse to those bottling people. It's a lucky thing for the village you were here to take charge. I suppose this means Angus can go home now. I suppose, Blair grumbled, though his eyes were already scanning the room for a mirror so he could straighten his tie. I'll have to process her. And you, Macbeth, clean yourself up. You're a disgrace to the uniform and a biological hazard. I'll take the evidence from here. My formal report will reflect that the arrest was made as a direct result of my strategic deployment of assets and the psychological pressure of my interrogation of the MacGregor man. Of course, sir. I'll just go and tell the Colonel's daughter and the hotel manager that it was all your doing. They were very worried about the investigation's progress, you understand, Hamish added, knowing that Blair's vanity was the only thing larger than his temper. Yes, you do that, Blair said, already reaching for the phone to call the chief constable. And Macbeth, don't think this earns you any points. You still look like a walking compost heap, Hamish nodded, turned, and led Lugs back out into the night. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. The credit had been shifted. Blair would be the hero of the hour. Angus would be free to grumble another day, and PC Hamish Macbeth would remain exactly where he wanted to be. The lazy, unremarkable constable of Lockdub. As he walked toward his cottage, the rain finally stopped, and a few stars peeking through the clouds reflected in the dark loch. He had saved the village, and more importantly, he had saved himself from a promotion. Hamish entered his small police station dwelling, the silence of the rooms acting as a soothing balm after the frantic, screeching accusations of Clara Miller and the abrasive, self-important barking of DC the First. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew he was finally unobserved, unbuttoning his sodden tunic-style jacket and letting it fall to the flagstone floor with a heavy, wet squelch. The peat mud had already begun to harden in the heat of the dying embers in the stove, forming a dark, brittle crust of ancient Scottish earth that seemed determined to claim him as part of the very landscape he had just protected. He filled the heavy iron kettle and placed it on the black range, listening to the first sharp crackle of the fresh rowan wood fire as it took hold. He didn't allow himself to think about the murder yet. Instead, he focused entirely on the sheer, unadulterated pleasure of being dry. He scrubbed himself in the tin bath until his skin was raw and glowing, the water turning the dark, opaque color of a Highland burn after a week of storms. By the time he was clean and draped in a thick, moth-eaten wool sweater that smelled faintly of lavender and old tobacco, the sky outside was turning a pale, ethereal lavender, the first light of a new dawn creeping over the silent peaks. Change, fragile clarity that felt like a gift. The relentless mist had finally lifted, leaving the mountains sharp and jagged against a sky the color of a robin's egg. In the village below, the news of the arrest had already settled into the local lore, becoming another storied layer to be discussed over pints at the MacLean Arms. DC Fies Blair had departed for Strathbane in a whirlwind of self-congratulatory sirens and gravel-spraying turns. His car loaded with evidence bags, and a renewed sense of importance that would likely sustain his ego through several months of boasting at the police club. He had stopped just long enough to shout one final, unnecessary insult at Hamish through the window of his something about the shameful state of the police station's flowerbeds, but Hamish had merely waved a large, freckled hand with a vacant and friendly smile. Angus MacGregor had been dropped off at the end of his long, winding track, ungrateful as ever. He had spent 10 minutes complaining that the police hadn't given him a lift all the way to his front door, and claiming that they had probably sampled his best malt whiskey while he was being kidnapped in the cells. Hamish watched the old man stomp toward his croft, knowing that the crofter's predictable misanthropy was the surest sign that life in Lockdub was returning to its natural prickly equilibrium. Hamish wandered down to the Tommel Castle Hotel later that afternoon, his hands deep in his pockets and his red hair still damp from the shower. The hotel was uncharacteristically quiet, the sanctuary for the awakened self now a dream that had dissolved into a legal nightmare of probate, murder evidence, and corporate litigation. Julian Vane and the representatives of Apex Solutions had vanished like smoke in a gale, their interest in the Tommel Spring suddenly evaporating once it became clear that any acquisition would be tied up in the Scottish courts for at least the next decade. He found Priscilla Halberton-Smythe in the walled garden, methodically cutting the last of the autumn roses. She looked up as he approached, a faint, knowing smile playing on her elegant features. She didn't ask about the details of the arrest, and she didn't mention the molecular signature he had described so vividly in the hotel lobby the night before. She simply looked at him, her eyes bright with an intelligence that always made him feel slightly transparent, and said, "I hear DCI Blair is already being nominated for a departmental commendation for his brilliant use of psychological pressure." Hamish leaned against the lichen-covered stone wall, watching a lone hawk circle high above the dark waters of the loch. "Aye, he's a clever man, the DCI. It's a wonder the rest of us can even find our boots in the morning without his expert guidance." Priscilla laughed, a sound like a clear mountain stream, and handed him a single, perfectly formed white rose. "You're a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth. But I suppose Lochstub is lucky to have a policeman who is far too lazy to be a hero." He walked back toward the station, the rose tucked into his buttonhole, feeling the gentle warmth of the pale sun on his face. The Sassenach tension that had gripped the village had faded, replaced by the familiar, slow-paced rhythm of the north. He stopped briefly by Mrs. Kennedy's post office to pay for the dog biscuits, actually using legal tender this time, which shocked the old woman into a silence that lasted nearly 4 seconds, and then made his way to the harbour to see if the salmon were moving near the bridge. The air was crisp and salt-tanged, and for a long moment he stood on the pier, looking out at the vast, shimmering expanse of the Atlantic. He thought briefly of Serena St. Cloud, a woman who had come to the Highlands to find herself and had instead found the oldest and most human of traps, the quiet envy of those she had overlooked. She had wanted to weave dreams, but she had forgotten that the most powerful threads are the ones that bind a community together, and that those threads are often invisible to those who only look at the surface. Back in his kitchen, Hamish set a pot of mutton stew to simmer on the stove, the savoury aroma filling the small room with a sense of safety and permanence. He sat at the wooden table, lugs resting contentedly at his feet, and opened a fresh pack of expensive coffee he had treated himself to. He was happy. He was staying in Lochstub. He had no promotions to fear, no city streets to patrol, and no corporate executives to placate. He was just the local Bobby, a man who knew the names of every sheep and every secret in the parish. He picked up his pipe, packed it with care, and watched the mountains as they began to turn a deep, royal purple in the gathering twilight. The peace had been disrupted, the blood had been spilled, and the drama had played its part. But as the first stars began to twinkle over the loch, Hamish Macbeth knew that the Highlands would always have the last word. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the village, a man content to remain hidden in plain view. He was Hamish Macbeth, and in the quiet of the Highland night, that was more than enough. The world could keep its chakras and its bottling plants. He had his fire, his dog, and his mountains. And as long as the rain continued to fall and the salmon continued to leap, he felt like the wealthiest man in the world. He reached down to scratch Lugs behind the ears, the dog letting out a satisfied sigh that perfectly echoed his master's own. The case was closed, the village was still, and for one more night, the peace of Lochstub was absolute. The following morning, the sun deigned to appear, if only to mock the lingering dankness of the Highlands. It was a pale, watery light that transformed the loch into a sheet of hammered silver and made the slate roofs of Lochstub glisten. PC Hamish Macbeth sat on the bench outside his police station, a mug of steaming coffee in his hands and Lugs resting his chin on Hamish's muddy boot. The station was quiet. The telephone had stopped ringing with inquiries from the press, and the village seemed to have collectively decided that the Dreamweaver was a chapter better left closed and forgotten. The official narrative was now etched in the stone of DC Thur's final report. A brilliant investigation led to the arrest of a disgruntled assistant who had succumbed to the pressures of a high-stakes corporate environment. Angus MacGregor had been cleared, though he was currently at the harbour telling anyone who would listen that he intended to sue the Strathbane police for emotional distress, and the price of a half bottle of malt he claimed was missing from his kitchen. Hamish listened to the distant sound of Angus shouting and smiled. It was a comfortable, familiar noise. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see Mr. Twellington, the local minister, standing there with a small, leather-bound book in his hand. The minister looked older in the morning light, his face etched with the weary wisdom of a man who had spent 40 years listening to the sins of a small parish. "A sad business, Hamish," the minister said, sitting down with a sigh. "I hear Clara Miller has made a full confession. She told the solicitors that the spirit of the glen told her to cleanse the manse of Serena's presence. A tragic case of a mind becoming as twisted as the roots of an old rowan tree." "Aye," Hamish replied, blowing the steam off his coffee. "But the spirit had a very corporate accent, I suspect. She was a clever woman, Clara. She knew that in this world, if you aren't the face of the brand, you're just the furniture. And nobody likes being treated like a chair, Minister." Is it true what Blair says? Mr. Wellington asked, his eyes searching Hamish's face. That his interrogation of the MacGregor boy broke the case. He's certainly making a great deal of noise about it down at the hotel. Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. Mr. Blair is a very loud man, and in my experience, the loudest people are usually the ones who need the most convincing of their own importance. If he wants to be the hero of the hour, who am I to stop him? It keeps him in Strathbane, and it keeps me here. That's a trade I'd make any day of the week. The minister nodded slowly. And the water rights? I hear the old manse is to be put back on the market, but with a new covenant. Priscilla's father, the colonel, has organised a trust to ensure it remains a private residence. No bottling plants, no sanctuaries. Just a house on a hill. That's the best news I've heard all week, Hamish said. And he meant it. After the minister had moved on, Hamish stood up and whistled for lugs. He had one final task to perform, one that didn't involve reports or handcuffs. He walked up the hill, past the village shop and the hotel, until he reached the edge of the woods overlooking the old manse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silk blue petal, the one he had taken from Moonbeam's fur. It was a small thing, a piece of artificial vanity that had no place in the rugged Sutherland landscape. He held it out in the palm of his hand, letting the wind catch it. The blue petal swirled in the air, a tiny synthetic spark against the vast green of the pines, before it was swept away toward the loch. He watched it go, feeling the weight of the mystery finally lift from his shoulders. Serena St. Cloud had come to Lochstub to find a dream, but she had failed to realize that the Highlands don't care for dreams that can be bought and sold. The mountains had seen seekers come and go for thousands of years. They had seen the ambitious, the greedy, and the lost, and in the end, they always reclaimed the silence. As he turned to head back down to the village, he saw Priscilla Halberton-Smythe's Land Rover pulling up to the hotel. She waved to him a short, elegant gesture that made his heart give a familiar, inconvenient thump. He waved back, a slow and easy movement, before adjusting his cap. He had a stove to light, a sheep that needed looking at, and a very large pot of stew that wouldn't cook itself. The peace of Lochstub had been restored, not by forensic science or corporate strategy, but by a man who knew how to sit quietly and wait for the truth to reveal itself. Hamish Macbeth began to hum a low Gaelic tune as he walked, his long legs eating up the ground. He was home. He was a simple village policeman with a dog and a pipe, and as the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, he knew that for as long as he could keep DC the First, Blair happy with the credit, he could keep the Highlands for himself. The dreamer was dead, but the glen was very much alive. And as Hamish pushed open the door to his station and felt the warmth of the range, he knew that he wouldn't trade his lazy life for all the gold in London. He was exactly where he belonged.